The morning sun rose over New Busan like it had for the past 15 years since humans first landed on this world. They called Kepler 442b, and the air smelled of fresh crops, and the sound of children playing filled the streets of the main city, where 2,300,000 people had built their lives far from Earth. Admiral Park Hyun-woo stood on the observation deck of the Planetary Defense Headquarters, watching the busy streets below where people went about their daily work in the markets and schools and factories that made this place feel like home, even though it was 47 light years from the world where humanity was born. And he smiled as he saw families walking together, knowing that many of these children had never seen Earth with their own eyes. Dr. Kim Sora was in her medical center treating a young boy who had fallen from his bicycle when her assistant ran in with a worried look on her face, saying that something strange was happening in orbit, and that Captain Lee Taemin from the space station had sent an urgent message for all senior staff to report to the command center. Immediately, Captain Lee stood in the control room of Aegis Station looking at his screens with growing fear as massive shapes appeared on the edge of the star system, moving faster than anything humans had ever built. And the ships were unlike anything in their databases, with crystalline hulls that seemed to bend light around them, and energy readings that made no sense according to human science down in the agricultural sector. 16-year-old Yoo Da-yoon was helping her parents harvest the new strain of wheat they had developed for this world when the emergency sirens began to wail across the colony, and her father dropped his tools with a look of confusion because there had never been an emergency like this in all the years they had lived here. The alien fleet numbered in the hundreds, with ships that were kilometers long and shaped like living crystal formations that pulsed with internal light, and they moved through space with grace that defied physics while human sensors struggled to understand how their technology worked, and within minutes they had surrounded the entire planet in a perfect sphere formation. Admiral Park received the first communication at exactly 14:37 local time, when every screen and speaker in the colony activated at once, and a voice spoke in perfect Korean and English and Spanish and every other language that humans used, saying words that would change everything forever. The voice was cold and mechanical, but somehow alive at the same time as it delivered its message without emotion or mercy, saying that the primitive species called humans had violated something called Galactic Decree 847 Alpha by building colonies beyond their designated area, and that this was not permitted by the ancient laws that governed space. The aliens called themselves the Hegemony and said they were a coalition of the oldest and most advanced species in the galaxy, who had ruled the stars for millions of years, and that younger races like humans were required to stay in their assigned zones until they proved themselves worthy of expansion, which could take thousands of years. They gave the humans 6 planetary rotations to evacuate everyone from New Busan and return to Earth, or face what they called planetary sterilization, and the way they said those words made it clear that they meant the complete destruction of everything and everyone on the world that humans had worked so hard to build. Admiral Park immediately called an emergency meeting with all the colony leaders, and Dr. Kim Sora joined them along with the heads of agriculture and engineering and education, and they all sat around the table looking at each other with the horrible knowledge that they could never evacuate 2 million people in 6 days. The colony had only 12 transport ships that could carry maybe 20,000 people each, and even if they packed them beyond safety limits, they might save 200,000 at most, which meant that over 2 million human beings would be left behind to face whatever the aliens meant. By sterilization, Captain Lee reported from orbit that his defense platforms were no match for the alien technology, and that the crystalline ships seemed to absorb energy weapons and deflect physical projectiles with some kind of force field that human science could not understand, and that fighting them would be suicide. But he was prepared to try. Dr. Kim So-ra began organizing the evacuation, starting with the children and elderly, while the colony engineers worked desperately to modify cargo ships and even atmospheric shuttles to carry more people. But everyone knew it was hopeless and that most of them would not see Earth again. Yoo Da-yoon helped load families onto the transport ships, and she watched her friends say goodbye to their parents who had volunteered to stay behind so that the children could escape. And she saw grown men and women crying as they realized this was the end of everything they had built together. The alien ships remained perfectly still in space like monuments to death while the humans scrambled to save who they could, and every few hours the cold voice would broadcast a countdown reminder that time was running out, and that the hegemony had been generous to give any warning at all on the 4th day. Admiral Park made the decision that would haunt him forever, and ordered Captain Lee to prepare the defense platforms for battle, knowing that it would mean certain death for everyone involved, but unable to simply surrender without a fight, because that was not the human way. The battle began when the evacuation ships tried to leave the planet, and the alien vessels moved to intercept them with weapons that seemed to tear space itself apart, and Captain Lee opened fire with everything his platforms had while screaming for the transports to run for their lives. The human weapons hit the crystalline ships and simply disappeared, as if they had never existed, while the alien response came in the form of beams of pure energy that cut through the defense platforms like they were made of paper, and within minutes Captain Lee and all his crew were dead. Dr. Kim So-ra managed to get one final message to Earth using the colony's most powerful transmitter, and she included everything. They had learned about the alien technology and weapons, and she begged Earth to remember New Busan and to make sure that humanity would never again be helpless against those who would destroy them. The message cut off as the first sterilization beam hit the main city and turned everything within 50 kilometers into molten glass and metal, while the remaining humans could only watch in horror as their world died around them in fire that burned hotter than the sun. Yu Da-yun was on one of the last transport ships to escape, and she pressed her face against the window, watching her home disappear in flashes of terrible light that erased 15 years of human dreams and hopes and love in just a few hours. The alien ships continued their work with mechanical efficiency, turning forests into ash and oceans into steam, and mountains into craters, until nothing remained of New Busan except a dead rock floating in space with no sign that humans had ever lived there at all. 2,100,000 people died that day, and the hegemony ships departed as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only silence and the terrible knowledge that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that the other children of the stars did not welcome them as friends. The few transport ships that escaped carried the survivors back to Earth with Dr. Kim So-ra's final message and the recordings of what had happened, and the promise that somehow humanity would find a way to make the galaxy pay for what it had done to the innocents of New Busan. 3 months after the news of New Busan reached Earth, the planet had changed in ways that no one could have imagined, and the 12 billion people who called it home now lived with the knowledge that humanity was not welcome in the galaxy, and that somewhere among the stars were beings who saw them as nothing more than insects to be stepped on. Fleet Admiral Choi Min-ho stood before the United Earth Defense Council in Geneva, looking at the faces of world leaders who had never imagined they would need to plan for war against alien enemies, and the weight of what had happened to New Busan pressed down on everyone in the room like a physical force. The footage from Dr. Kim So-ra's final transmission played on the screens around the chamber, showing the crystalline ships of the hegemony and their terrible weapons that could turn entire cities into glass. And the leaders watched in silence as they saw the last moments of 2 million human lives ended without mercy or hesitation. Director Han Ye-jin from the Advanced Weapons Division presented her analysis of the alien technology based on the sensor data that Dr. Kim had managed to send, and the news was both terrifying and enlightening because it showed that while the hegemony had weapons beyond human understanding, they were not gods, and their ships followed the same laws of physics that governed everything else. Prime Minister Jang Hee-young spoke for all of humanity when she declared that the destruction of New Busan would not go unanswered, and that Earth would never again allow itself to be defenseless against those who would destroy human civilization. And she called for a mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. General Bae Sung-jun explained that Earth's current military forces consisted of 3,000 ships designed for exploring space and defending against pirates and asteroids, but not for fighting an enemy that could destroy planets, and he estimated that the entire Earth fleet would last maybe 10 minutes against the force that had eliminated New Busan. The intercepted hegemony communications that human intelligence had managed to decode painted a picture of an ancient alliance of alien species who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years and saw younger races as temporary problems to be managed or eliminated. And they spoke of humans the way humans might speak of a virus that needed to be contained. Director Han revealed the existence of Project Prometheus, which had been developing new shipbuilding techniques in secret for the past decade, using nanotechnology and automated construction systems that could build vessels faster than any human factory had ever produced anything, and the project had been waiting for the right moment to begin mass production. The scale of what Director Han proposed was staggering because she wanted to convert every industrial facility on Earth and in the solar system to ship construction and use the automated systems to build not thousands but hundreds of thousands of warships in the span of 2 years. The Earth Council listened as she explained how the asteroid belt could be turned into massive automated factories and how the Moon's industrial facilities could be expanded to cover half its surface, and how even the hostile environment of Venus could be used for testing the most dangerous weapons that human science could devise. Prime Minister Jiang asked the question that everyone was thinking, which was whether humanity had the right to build such a massive military force, and whether they would become the very thing they were fighting against. But Fleet Admiral Choi answered that the galaxy had already shown what it thought of human rights when it erased New Busan. The vote was unanimous, and within hours every space dock and orbital platform and asteroid mining facility in the solar system received new orders to begin the greatest military buildup in human history, and the people of Earth responded with an anger and determination that surprised even their leaders. The transformation began immediately as civilian factories were converted to military production, and universities were ordered to focus all research on weapons and ship design, and every human colony received instructions to contribute whatever resources they could to the war effort. The aliens had made one critical mistake in their assumptions about humanity, because they expected a primitive species to simply retreat to their home world and accept the boundaries that had been set for them. But they had never encountered a species with humanity's industrial capacity and determination. Within weeks, the first new shipyards were operational, and the automated construction systems began producing vessels at a rate that defied belief as thousands of ships took shape in Earth orbit, and the lunar facilities and the converted asteroid mines where robot workers labored around the clock. The new ship designs incorporated everything that human scientists had learned from Dr. Kim So-ra's data about hegemony technology, and while they could not replicate the aliens' energy absorption systems, they found ways to make human weapons more effective. Against crystalline hulls and force fields, engineer Nam Soo-bin led the team that designed the new Titan-class battleships, which were 5 kilometers long and armed with weapons that could crack planets, and she worked 18 hours a day alongside thousands of other engineers who had volunteered to help build humanity's response to genocide. Dr. Ryu Yunji made the breakthrough that changed everything when she figured out how to create quantum disruption weapons based on the sensor readings from New Busan, and these devices could tear apart matter at the subatomic level, which meant they could destroy anything regardless of how advanced its defenses might be. The hegemony began to take notice of Earth's activities when their spy networks reported the massive construction projects and the incredible rate of ship production, and they sent diplomatic messages to other species warning of the dangerous humans who were militarizing at an unprecedented rate. Most alien species joined the hegemony out of fear or ancient obligation, but a few smaller races secretly began to hope that maybe the humans could succeed where everyone else had failed and break the chains that had bound the galaxy for so long under the rule of the ancient powers. Captain Oh Dong-hyun took command of the first completed Titan-class battleship, which was named Incheon's Fury, after one of the cities that had been destroyed on New Busan, and he led the initial test flights that proved the new ships were faster and more heavily armed than anything humanity had ever built. The industrial capacity of Earth and its colonies working together created a production rate that amazed even the humans themselves as new ships rolled out of the automated factories every day, and the fleet grew from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands in a span of months. Admiral Shin Jae-wook commanded the Home Defense Fleet, which protected Earth while the main battle fleet was being constructed, and he reported that alien scout ships had been spotted at the edge of the solar system, watching the human buildup with what could only be described as growing alarm. Intelligence reports revealed that the hegemony consisted of 12 ancient species, led by beings called Archons who had ruled the galaxy since before human civilization existed, and they were beginning to realize that they had awakened something dangerous when they destroyed New Busan. The propaganda broadcasts from hegemony space spoke of the human plague and the need to contain the militaristic species before they could spread their violence to other worlds. But the humans who intercepted these messages only became more determined to prove the aliens right about their capacity for war as the 500,000 ship took shape in Earth's orbital shipyards. Fleet Admiral Choi received intelligence that confirmed their worst fears because the hegemony was planning a preemptive strike on Earth itself, having designated humanity as what they called a Class Omega threat to galactic stability. The irony was not lost on anyone that the aliens who had casually committed genocide against New Busan were now claiming that humans were the dangerous ones, but the time for diplomatic protests had ended. The moment 2 million innocent people were turned to ash and glass, Prime Minister Jiang addressed the people of Earth on the second anniversary of the New Busan massacre, and she promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, and that humanity would carry their memory into battle against those who believed that might made right in the cold darkness between the stars. The 500,000 ships of humanity's new fleet represented the largest military force ever assembled by a single species, and they carried weapons that could reshape the galaxy. But more importantly, they carried the fury of a people who had learned that sometimes peace could only be preserved through the threat of overwhelming violence. Earth was no longer the small blue world that had once seemed so insignificant in the vastness of space, but had become the beating heart of a war machine that would make the galaxy tremble, and the children of New Busan would finally have their justice served at the point of human guns. 18 months had passed since Earth declared war on the galaxy, and the solar system no longer looked like the peaceful place where humanity had grown up, because every planet and moon and asteroid had been transformed into part of the greatest military-industrial complex that had ever existed in known space. The sun itself was surrounded by massive orbital shipyards that stretched in concentric rings from the orbit of Mercury all the way out to Jupiter, and the light of day was often blocked by the shadows of ships so large that they could be seen with the naked eye from Earth's surface, as they took shape in the automated construction facilities. Engineer Nam Soo-bin stood in the observation deck of Shipyard Alpha 7, watching the 5-kilometer-long hull of another Titan-class battleship take shape as millions of robotic workers swarmed over its crystalline armor plating that had been reverse-engineered from the fragments of hegemony technology found in Dr. Kim So-ra's final transmission. The asteroid belt had been completely transformed into a network of automated factories that worked around the clock, building everything from the smallest fighter craft to the massive dreadnoughts that would serve as flagships for the human fleet, and the rate of production was so fast that new ships were completed every few hours. Captain Oh Dong-hyun walked through the bridge of the UES Incheon's Fury, which had become the template for all of humanity's new warships, and he marveled at the quantum disruption cannons that Dr. Ryu Yunji had designed, based on her analysis of how the hegemony weapons worked, and these new guns could tear apart matter at the subatomic level. Dr. Ryu Yunji worked in her laboratory, deep beneath the surface of Luna, where the most dangerous weapons research was conducted in facilities that could contain explosions capable of cracking moons, and her latest breakthrough was a torpedo that could phase through normal matter and detonate inside enemy ships where their armor could not protect them. Admiral Shin Jae-wook commanded the home defense fleet from his flagship orbiting Earth, and he watched the constant stream of new ships joining his forces, while wondering if even 500,000 vessels would be enough to face an enemy that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. The transformation of Venus had been the most ambitious project of all, because the planet's hellish environment of acid clouds and crushing pressure made it the perfect testing ground for weapons that were too dangerous to use anywhere else. And the results of those tests had given humanity weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Intelligence reports from deep space showed that the hegemony was finally taking the human threat seriously, as they began recalling their scattered fleets and fortifying their core worlds, while sending desperate diplomatic messages to every species in the galaxy, warning of the coming human invasion. The spy networks that humanity had established using automated probes revealed that the hegemony consisted of 12 ancient species, led by beings called Archons, who had not faced a serious military challenge in over 1 million years, and they were struggling to adapt to fighting an enemy that could match their technology. Captain Lim Hai-wan led the reconnaissance division that gathered intelligence about hegemony space, using stealth ships equipped with quantum sensors that could observe enemy movements from light years away, and her reports painted a picture of an empire that was vast but also brittle, after eons of unchallenged rule. The smaller alien species that had been oppressed by the hegemony for millennia began sending secret messages to Earth offering intelligence about enemy weaknesses and defensive positions in exchange for protection from the coming war, and humanity welcomed these allies while preparing to fight alone if necessary. Commander Park Ji-hoon trained the elite boarding teams that would capture enemy ships during the coming battles, and his soldiers practiced fighting in the exotic environments they might encounter while wearing armor that incorporated the best of human and alien technology. Automated factories of the asteroid belt worked with such efficiency that they consumed entire asteroids in days and turned them into fleets of warships, while the mining operations expanded to include the moons of the outer planets, and even some of the smaller planetoids beyond Pluto fleet. Admiral Choi Min-ho reviewed the final deployment plans for Operation Righteous Fury, which would be the largest military operation in galactic history, as 500,000 human ships advanced across thousands of light years to bring justice to those who had destroyed New Busan. The quantum communication networks that connected every human ship allowed for coordination on a scale that the galaxy had never seen, and Fleet Admiral Choi could command his entire force in real time regardless of how far they might be scattered across the vastness of space. Dr. Ryu Yunji's quantum disruption technology had been scaled up to create planet-killer weapons that could shatter entire worlds, but the Earth Council had voted unanimously that such weapons would only be used against military targets, because humanity would not become the genocidal monsters that they were fighting. The hegemony's diplomatic efforts to turn the galaxy against humanity had largely failed because too many species remembered their own suffering under the rule of the Archons, and they were willing to risk supporting the humans if it meant a chance at freedom from their ancient oppressors. Engineer Nam Subin's latest creation was the Omega-class command ship that would serve as Fleet Admiral Choi's mobile headquarters during the coming campaign, and it was equipped with enough firepower to destroy entire star systems while also carrying the most advanced communication and sensor equipment that human science could produce. The transformation of human society had been as dramatic as the industrial changes, because every person on Earth and in the colonies now lived with the single purpose of supporting the war effort, and the people worked with a determination born from the knowledge that failure meant the extinction of their species. Intelligence reports revealed that the hegemony was planning to make their final stand at their capital world of Kronos Prime, which was protected by ancient defensive systems that had never been breached, and weapons that could destroy entire invasion fleets. But humanity was no longer the weak species that had begged for mercy at New Busan. Captain Oh Dong-hyun led the first combat patrols beyond the solar system using ships that were faster and more heavily armed than anything the galaxy had ever seen, and his crews reported that the very sight of human vessels was enough to send alien traders fleeing in terror. The 500,000 ships of humanity's fleet represented more than just military might, because they carried the hopes and dreams of every human who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. And now they knew. The answer was yes. They were alone, but they were not helpless. Admiral Shin Jae-wook received the final intelligence reports confirming that the hegemony was preparing for a preemptive strike on Earth, using their most powerful fleets in a desperate attempt to stop the human war machine before it could be unleashed on their empire. The robotic workers in the orbital shipyards put the finishing touches on the last ships of the human fleet, while down on Earth, families said goodbye to their loved ones who would crew these vessels into the unknown dangers of galactic war, knowing that many would never return home. Fleet Admiral Choi stood on the bridge of his flagship looking out at the greatest armada in galactic history, and he thought of the children who had died on New Busan and promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, and that humanity would make the galaxy safe for all the innocent species who had suffered under the hegemony's rule. The quantum sensors detected movement in deep space as alien fleets began advancing toward Earth, and the moment that everyone had been preparing for was finally at hand as humanity prepared to find out whether their massive gamble would save their species or doom them all to the same fate that had befallen New Busan. The 500,000 ships of the human fleet began moving into formation as Fleet Admiral Choi gave the order that would change the galaxy forever, and the greatest military force ever assembled by a single species prepared to march into the darkness between the stars carrying the fury of Earth and the promise of justice for the dead. 2 years after the destruction of New Busan, the human fleet finally left the solar system and began its advance toward the core worlds of the hegemony in a display of military might that had never been seen in the galaxy, as 500,000 ships moved through hyperspace in perfect formation, like a river of death flowing across the stars. Admiral Ko In-sung commanded the first strike fleet from his flagship as they emerged from hyperspace at the edge of hegemony territory and found themselves facing empty space where enemy scouts had fled, rather than confront the overwhelming force that humanity had assembled for this moment of reckoning. The first human victories came at the outer defense stations where small hegemony garrisons tried to delay the advancing fleet, but were swept aside in battles that lasted only minutes as the quantum disruption weapons tore through crystalline hulls and force fields that had protected alien ships for millennia. Captain Lim Hee-won led her reconnaissance ships deep into enemy territory using stealth technology that the hegemony could not detect, and her reports revealed the true scope of their empire, which included dozens of enslaved species and prison worlds, where billions of beings suffered under the rule of the ancient archons. The liberation of the first prison camp at Sigma Draconis shocked even the hardened human soldiers when they found millions of beings from a dozen different species who had been worked as slaves for centuries, and many of them fell to their knees weeping when they realized that someone had finally come to free them from their nightmare. Commander Park Ji-hoon's boarding teams captured their first hegemony command ship intact, and the intelligence they recovered painted a picture of an empire that was crumbling from within, as species after species began to revolt against their oppressors. Now that humanity had proven the Archons were not invincible, the Battle of Centauri Gate became the first major engagement when Admiral Ko's fleet encountered a hegemony force of 15,000 ships, defending the strategic choke point that controlled access to their inner territories, and the aliens made their stand with the confidence of beings who had never known defeat. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, the Centauri Gate was littered with the wreckage of alien ships, while the human fleet had lost only 300 vessels, and the galaxy watched in shock as tactical recordings showed human weapons systematically dismantling forces that had been considered invincible. Ambassador Chen Wei-ming made contact with the Vorlak species whose homeworld had been devastated by the hegemony centuries ago, and they offered to provide intelligence about enemy positions in exchange for protection from the retribution that would surely come when the Archons learned of their betrayal. The secret alliances that began forming across the galaxy gave humanity access to information that had been gathered over thousands of years by species who had been forced to serve their oppressors while dreaming of the day when they might be free to choose their own destiny. Intelligence reports revealed that the hegemony leadership was in chaos as they struggled to coordinate a defense against an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once, using hyperspace technology that was faster and more efficient than their own ancient systems. The Vorlak provided detailed maps of the hegemony's defensive networks and warned that the Archons were retreating to their heavily fortified core worlds while preparing to use planet-killing weapons that could destroy entire star systems rather than allow them to fall into human hands. Captain Lim Hee-won's reconnaissance missions discovered evidence of genocide on a scale that horrified even humans who had seen what happened to New Busan, as they found the remains of dozens of species that had been completely exterminated for the crime of refusing to submit to hegemony rule. The human advance continued through system after system as the aliens fell back before the overwhelming firepower of the Earth fleet, and each victory brought new allies, who emerged from hiding to offer their support to the species that had finally brought hope to the Galaxy Commander Park. Ji-hoon led the assault on a hegemony research facility and captured scientists who revealed the location of Kronos Prime, and warned that the ancient capital world was protected by defensive systems that had been built over millions of years and had never been breached by any enemy. The liberation of the Centauri colonies revealed the true horror of hegemony rule, as human soldiers found entire worlds where the population had been reduced to slavery, and the children were taken from their parents to be raised as soldiers in the alien armies. Admiral Ko received reports that several hegemony species were attempting to surrender and offering to switch sides in exchange for mercy. But Fleet Admiral Choi ordered that all such requests be refused because humanity would accept nothing less than total victory and the complete dismantling of the empire. The Battle of Wolf 359 demonstrated the true power of human weapons, when a single Titan-class battleship destroyed an entire hegemony defense platform using quantum disruption torpedoes that phased through the station's shields and detonated inside its reactor core. The psychological effect of these victories spread throughout the galaxy as species that had been oppressed for millennia began to believe that freedom was possible, and uprisings started on worlds throughout hegemony space forcing the aliens to divert forces from the main battlefront. Intelligence gathered from captured enemy ships revealed that the Archons were ancient beings who had ruled the galaxy since before most species had developed spaceflight, and they saw themselves as the rightful masters of all life in the universe, with younger races existing only to serve their purposes. The human fleet split into multiple battle groups to attack targets across a front that stretched for thousands of light years, and the hegemony found themselves unable to respond effectively to an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time with overwhelming force. Captain Lim Hee-won discovered a secret hegemony archive that contained records of their crimes spanning millions of years, including the complete extermination of over 100 species and the enslavement of countless others in a reign of terror that had lasted since the dawn of galactic civilization. The liberation of each world brought new horrors to light, as human soldiers found mass graves and experimentation facilities where the aliens had conducted research on living beings from dozens of species, and the evidence made it clear that the hegemony had to be stopped at any cost. Commander Park Ji-hoon's elite teams captured a hegemony Archon alive for the first time, and the ancient being revealed under interrogation that Kronos Prime was protected by weapons that could destroy stars, and that the final battle would determine whether the galaxy would be ruled by law or chaos. The advance toward the hegemony capital gained momentum as more and more alien species joined the human cause and provided intelligence about enemy movements, while their own fleets added to the growing armada that would assault the most heavily defended world in the galaxy. Admiral Ko received word that the hegemony was planning to use their planet-killer weapons against Earth in a final desperate attempt to stop the human advance. But the quantum communication networks allowed Fleet Admiral Choi to coordinate a response that would protect the homeworld while continuing the offensive. The captured hegemony records revealed that Kronos Prime was surrounded by a defensive grid of over 1 million automated weapon platforms and protected by a fleet of 200,000 ships that had never been defeated in combat. But humanity had come too far to be stopped by any force that the galaxy could assemble. The final phase of the march to war began as the human fleet consolidated into 50 battle groups, each capable of conquering entire star systems, and they moved inexorably toward Kronos Prime, carrying the fury of 2 million dead colonists and the hopes of every oppressed species in the galaxy. The final battle for Kronos Prime began when the human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the hegemony capital system and found themselves facing the greatest concentration of military power that the galaxy had ever assembled, as 200,000 alien ships formed defensive lines around the ancient world that had ruled the stars for millions of years. Fleet Admiral Choi Min-ho stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the tactical displays that showed the massive, defensive grid surrounding Kronos Prime, and he knew that this would be the bloodiest battle in galactic history, but he also knew that humanity had come too far to turn back. Now the planet itself was protected by weapon platforms that had been built over eons and could destroy entire fleets with energy beams that tapped into the power of the system's star, and the ancient technology made even human quantum weapons seem primitive by comparison. Captain Yu Da-eun now commanded her own destroyer at the age of 20, having risen through the ranks during the long campaign, and she carried the weight of being one of the few survivors of New Busan as she prepared to lead her ship into the battle that would decide the fate of the Galaxy High. Archon Velthara watched from her command center deep beneath the surface of Kronos Prime as the human fleet approached, and she could not understand how a species that had been confined to a single star system just a few years ago had managed to threaten the empire that her people had built over millions of years. The first wave of the human assault consisted of 50,000 ships that moved in perfect coordination as they engaged the outer defensive ring and the space around Kronos Prime lit up with weapons fire that could be seen from neighboring star systems. As the two greatest military forces in galactic history clashed, the ancient weapon platforms proved their worth as they destroyed hundreds of human ships, with each shot. But Fleet Admiral Choi had anticipated this, and his forces used their superior speed and maneuverability to avoid the massive energy beams while closing to ranges where their quantum weapons could be effective. Captain Yu Da-un led her squadron through the defensive grid using tactics that had been developed during the long march to war, and her ships phased their torpedoes through the alien shields to strike at the reactor cores that powered the ancient weapons. The battle raged for 6 days as wave after wave of human ships threw themselves against the hegemony defenses, and the casualties mounted on both sides until the space around Kronos Prime was filled with the wreckage of vessels from dozens of different species. Commander Park Ji-hoon's elite boarding teams fought their way through the corridors of alien ships and space stations using weapons and armor that incorporated the best of human and captured alien technology, and they left behind them a trail of defeated enemies who had thought themselves invincible. The turning point came when Dr. Ryu Yunji's planet-killer weapons were finally deployed against the largest defensive platforms and the ancient structures that had protected Kronos Prime for eons were torn apart by quantum disruption fields that unraveled matter at the subatomic level. High Archon Velthara realized that her empire was doomed when the defensive grid began to fail, and she authorized the use of the Starkiller, weapons that could destroy the entire system rather than allow it to fall into human hands. But Fleet Admiral Choi had anticipated this final, desperate move. The human fleet had secretly deployed quantum inhibitor fields throughout the system, and when the hegemony tried to trigger their ultimate weapons, they found that the technology simply would not function, because the laws of physics themselves had been altered in the space around Kronos. Prime Captain Yu Da-un led the final assault on the planetary surface as human forces fought their way through the ancient cities that had been built by species whose names were lost to history, and she carried with her the memory of every person who had died on New Busan. The capture of High Archon Velthara marked the end of the battle and the collapse of the hegemony, as the ancient ruler was brought before Fleet Admiral Choi in chains, after having ruled the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. The aftermath of the victory was almost as challenging as the battle itself, because humanity suddenly found itself in control of an empire that spanned thousands of star systems and included hundreds of different species who looked to them for leadership. President Kim Soo-jin addressed the galaxy from Earth and announced that humanity had no intention of becoming the new oppressors, but instead proposed the creation of the Galactic Democracy Accords, which would give every species an equal voice in governing their own destiny. The former hegemony species were given a choice between peaceful integration into the new galactic order or exile to distant galaxies, where they could no longer threaten other races, and most chose to accept the human terms rather than face the alternative. Captain Yu Da-un stood in the ruins of the Archon Palace on Kronos Prime and thought of her friends who had died when New Busan was destroyed, and she knew that their sacrifice had not been in vain because the galaxy would never again allow such atrocities to be committed. The establishment of the new galactic government took years as representatives from hundreds of species gathered on Earth to draft the constitution that would govern their shared future, and humanity found itself cast in the role of protector rather than conqueror. The 500,000 ships of the human fleet became the enforcement arm of the new galactic order, patrolling the space lanes and protecting developing civilizations from those who would exploit or destroy them, and the galaxy enjoyed a peace that had not existed for millions of years. Fleet Admiral Choi retired to become the first director of galactic security, and he established the principles that would guide humanity's use of their overwhelming military power, ensuring that it would be used to protect the innocent rather than to dominate the weak. The memorial built on the ruins of New Busan became a pilgrimage site for beings from across the galaxy, who came to pay their respects to the 2 million humans whose deaths had sparked the revolution that freed the stars from tyranny. Engineer Nam Soo-bin led the teams that converted the massive human fleet from weapons of war to tools of exploration and construction, as humanity began the long task of rebuilding the worlds that had been devastated by millions of years of hegemony rule. Dr. Ryu Yunji's research into quantum physics opened new frontiers of science that benefited all species as the technology that had been developed for war was turned to peaceful purposes, and the galaxy entered an age of unprecedented scientific advancement. The Vorlak and other species that had helped humanity during the war were given positions of honor in the new government, and their knowledge of the galaxy's history helped ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Admiral Ko In-sung established the Galactic Patrol that would monitor the space between the stars and respond to threats before they could grow large enough to endanger entire civilizations, and his ships carried crews from dozens of different species working together. Captain Lim Hai-wan became the head of Galactic Intelligence, and her networks gathered information about potential threats while also working to heal the wounds that had been left by millions of years of oppression and war. The Constitution of the Galactic Democracy was signed by representatives of over 300 species and established the principle that no single race would ever again be allowed to dominate the others, and that the rights of all sentient beings would be protected by law 5 years after the Battle of Kronos. Prime Captain Yu Da-yoon returned to New Busan as the governor of the rebuilt colony, and she stood before the memorial that honored the dead, while looking up at the ships that patrolled the skies to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The inscription on the memorial was written in Korean and 50 other languages, and it read simply that their deaths had given birth to galactic freedom, and that their memory would guide the living to never forget the price of peace. President Kim Soo-jin's final address to the galaxy before stepping down spoke of the responsibility that came with power, and the need for constant vigilance to ensure that the freedom that had been won with so much blood would be preserved for future generations. The human fleet continued to patrol the galaxy as guardians rather than conquerors, and their presence served as a reminder that overwhelming force could be used to protect rather than oppress, and that sometimes the only way to ensure peace was to be prepared for war. The children who grew up in the new galactic order learned the story of New Busan and the Great War that followed, and they understood that freedom was not free, and that it was their duty to protect what their parents had won with such terrible sacrifice.